Geoff, how are you, sir? You well?
I'm well, thank you. In splendid isolation.
Everyone's getting used to it now. I thought, well, we spoke a couple of months ago at the height of the furore and negative energy that was surrounding the whole George Floyd debacle, but we focused on the way in which organisations, institutions had responded, a lot of them favourably in terms of looking inward and doing more or presenting a case that they were going to do more to address the iniquity wherever they see it. So just a couple of months on, as we approach August, I thought it'd be good to touch base with you to see what you've been up to in that space. I know you're active. And just what you think about how the landscape is evolving.
John, thanks for having me. And I think, as we have now reached, I think, a very important moment in time with everybody very aware, and still markedly wanting to see something happen. And I think we need to look at this in the intergenerational round. The young people are not giving up on wishing to see a more equitably just and fairer outcome of the George Floyd legacy in this country. So if I said across the pond in America, we are seeing historical changes made at state level, city level, and federal. Even in the White House, no matter what's being said, changes are happening because there's an election looming. And there is always great change. And the great thing about America is the legislative changes are equally being driven by sportsmen and women and people who have the cultural ability to engage those citizens. Now let's look at ourselves across the pond. And on the basis of what I still believe, with my many years from street to stadium, back to the streets, with sport, as its sense and vehicle of impacting and affecting social and cultural change, is that we have a way to go on the basis that all the sporting institutions, sportsmen and women, in some way, shape or form, in response to the George Floyd killing, came out and followed Colin Kaepernick by taking the knee. He did so in 2016, was vilified, was ostracized at great cost. And it shows sometimes that the great sacrifice and symbol of effort can be sometimes many years before it's recognized in its true meaning. By the way, taking the knee was symbolized by the late Martin Luther King and now the late John Lewis, the six that took to the knee as part of their statement of non-violence in response to the incredulous and unacceptable violence that they were subjected to as a movement seeking civil right and racial justice. So we see sport moving through, and it's important to understand whether it was Jesse Owens in the Berlin Olympics, whether it was Tommy Smith and John Carlos, who actually made me conscious as a young boy as to what that was to symbolize. Muhammad Ali, Arthur Ashe. These people have helped shape who I am and why sport needed to be something more. The Soweto uprisings in '76, Mandela, boxing in that cell kept him mentally, physically, emotionally sound. I was to learn from him how it kept him able, and as a result on Robben Island, to bring together those that shared hard time, that they would use the National Sports Council, which they formulated on Robben Island, to plan the liberation of South Africa. So sport has always socially, culturally, economically, and even politically shaped and influenced our societies. What we have at this moment in time are lots of pledges, platitudes, and promises, but we don't have any definitive impact that is sustainable and credible. Whether we have sportsmen and women doing what they do symbolically, whether we had the massive statement made by our current Sport England member who likened the lack of change and impact in the all-important areas of equality, diversity, and inclusion as sporting apartheid. It's worth noting that Paul Stevenson, the first Black member of the then GB Sports Council, resigned, accusing the then board of being apartheid-like in their culture.
Put some perspective on that for those who might not know when that occurred.
Sorry, that era would have been in the 70s. when Sport England, the then Great Britain Sports Council, was formed. And Paul Stevenson was an activist, very much in the anti-apartheid movement. And he inspired me a great deal when I was competing, being aware, as was Sam Ramsamy as an exile over here, and looking at sport and what it would do. And as we know, the international ban on sport for South Africa was one of the central weapons in bringing down apartheid. So once Paul Stevenson stepped away, it was a damning indictment on the sporting institutions of the time, and what would have been deemed and termed as institutionally racist by the Macpherson report following the murder of Stephen Lawrence. And that was our George Floyd moment. And I remember then, in what would have been coming to the end of my 11 years at Sport England, when it then became Sport England and I became the only third black member of that board, witnessing and experiencing what Paul Stevenson meant. However, the board then had males that didn't look like me, were prepared to respect sporting achievement, and then you had to weather it. You had to endure, and then you had to pick and choose your moment and challenge facts, figures, and evidence. That brought, at the time, don't forget we had the 80s of the riots, the response to Sport for All, and then as we moved into the 90s, there had to be change. There was something on Panorama called the Race Game. And Ron Pickering, the late Ron Pickering, who championed the cause for those of us of diversity, the BBC commentator. After Panorama, I was brought on to Sport England. And for those 11 years, we challenged and we asked and we fought and we produced what would then lead to the Commission for Racial Equality, Kick It Out, the Racial Equality Advisory Group that became Sporting Equals. And as I left Sport England, that was my legacy. There was a breakdown, and Garth Crook served as a board member, Tessa Sollerson served as a board member. We had 2 in the senior executive, and we had a number of officers. That's what we had. If we look at what we have now, it is nowhere near a progressive step that suggests that participation in sport is reflected in the leadership of sport.
Why is that?
Why is that? Is because consistent policies and pronouncements have failed. It's an obvious fact. The evidence is there, because in this instance of global awareness as to racial injustice, another pledge was made, reflective of the Sport and Recreation Alliance, that we will look at greater diversity on boards. Tracy Crouch, before she stepped down as sports minister, launched Sport Code 2.0, and that was supposed to be the benchmark. And governing bodies were going to be given additional funding. They were going to be incentivized as well as penalized. And still nothing happened, because we do have to hold each other to account. These are public funds, whether lottery or exchequer funding. Sporting Equals are supposed to be our pressure group for all the right reasons, but they have to be independent in order to do that.
Aren't they working towards that?
With all due respect, I finished in 2001. We're now in 2020. I'm a results-based orientated individual. That's what's characterized my sporting life, my public life, and my work with young people on the streets. So when a life is lost on the streets, I believe, or when a life is lost in crime, they say in Australia, a kid in sport is a kid out of court. And what I'm saying is, whilst all of this has not seen the right diversity of thinking, look, experience, and contribution, it has not informed the policies, the strategies, and the resources that would see us enjoying a better offer of 21st century sport for all. And my final point is with regards to everybody has made a pronouncement. Everybody has said this is the right thing to do. Why have the sporting bodies, the institutional sporting bodies, not all come together? The football community did so some weeks ago. So I'm very shocked and surprised that Paul Elliott, one of the greatest servants of football of late, that has championed the sport diversity and inclusion agenda, following a nomination and suggestion of Greg Clark, the chair, that he come to the board and be afforded a place on the board, has not been granted that opportunity. Now that is a worrying sign, bearing in mind that we all heard the pledges, the platitudes, and the promises. that we were going to work together to come up with tangible and evidenced impact that we were serious. And I think with the announcement with Paul Elliott, I think there's cause for great concern. The Sport and Recreation Alliance, again, pronouncements that 85% of their members, what happened to the other 15%? What happens to them? How do we improve how they can be more? So, well, who are they? How do we help them? How do we equip them? Because there's equally a recognition that when we launch these initiatives, most of the governing bodies might be well-meaning. They were in 2000 when the McPherson report was produced, but how do we put it in place? Well, they say sport brings people together. When we were in a team and in a squad, different backgrounds, cultures, beliefs, and ambitions. But it's because you take the time to work together, understand, well, where's that forum? Where are the institutions of sport coming together, not just football, all of the institutions of sport come together, come up with a plan, something that's realistic, pragmatic, and impactful and sustainable. Have the Minister for Sport and the Secretary of State for Culture actually sit down and they should be bringing this together and saying, this is what we're going to do. And there are enough faces in the crowd that look like us, that have enough wisdom, knowledge, and experience. Because I've been talking to those who don't look like us, people I've known through my 30 years in public life. These are fair-minded people. That's why I'm struggling to understand as to how we're not able to have a whole sport plan that is equitably diverse and inclusive.
Your journey, if I equate it to being at the bottom of the mountain and the top of the mountain is our utopia as a community, all embracing of some of the things you want to implement. What does that view look like and where are we on that mountain?
Whoa. For me, the thing that reactivated me, and I'm going to speak first as a black man, because that is who I am. And I was always told when I was going through my sports administration, sports political years, that I was a threat. I was intimidating. The energy that I applied in winning for Britain seemed very strangely curious and almost unnerving when I was trying to represent Britain in public life. And many bids, World Cup bids, Olympic bids, I had experiences that told me that what my utopia was in, let's just say, achieving as much as I achieved in my sporting credentials, that I'd have the ambitions, and I'll share this with you. When I applied to be the chair of Sport England in 2009, I was the nominated candidate. For whatever reason, I was not appointable. And that was my dream, to apply myself as I had in my sport, in now reflective back into what sport had done for me as a product of Sport for All. And I remember that knocking my confidence considerably. And my last number of years at Sport England were not nice. They were not what I would have hoped. And then I looked at it again, and I got involved in the Olympic bids and the World Cup bids. And there was always a point where the glass ceiling seemed double glazed. So for me, I would wanted to have hoped that for all that was contributed to by a very unique group, and Lord Herman Ousley, Brian Pope Hunt, Mohamed Afzal, Brendan Batson, Camille Rickett. I remember that Racial Equality Advisory Group. It was a quality group. Lorna Booth, former Olympian, Commonwealth Games champion, was an officer at Sport England. You know, we worked hard. To see that not really translate into something that would suggest, whilst it might not be afforded to me, why can't it be afforded to the talent and potential that we currently have? Why can't they be not just on the boards, but in the senior leadership, in the executive leadership teams? Why can't we have, a lot of companies are having audits to see where they are. Why aren't we seeing audits in the Sport and Recreation Alliance, in the British Olympic Association, in Sport England, in UK Sport, in Sports Coach UK? All of those, well, let's have an audit. Let's see where we are. And let's look at how we can improve. So I still believe that we're at the bottom of that mountain. We're not ascended to the top of that mountain.
But are we still at the bottom though?
And over the last number of weeks, I've done my audit. The only institution I will share with you now that is beginning to show an exemplar as to how we should be is the Commonwealth Games Federation.
And that's recent, right?
Louise O'Brien stepped down as chair, and we now have a Commonwealth chair who looks like us, who has the credentials, who has the experience, and I think it's been a very big statement. And other members are looking to step down from the board to make way. That is credible. That is to be acknowledged. David Grevenberg has equally been doing his work. He hasn't responded to my calls yet, but he knows I'm going to find him, because Birmingham 2022, I'm told that board members are now stepping down because it wasn't diverse enough. But people must not believe that we should now go into a mass recruitment of faces that tick a box. It's called affirmative action by default. That is why I'm saying, for the years and years of post-war sporting achievement of people of colour, black particular achievers, there should be a greater representation and reflection of that generation in the respective sector, movement and industry that is sport.
They're saying, a lot of them, like you've already identified, are saying the right things now, but there's talking and there's action. So what action would you like to see moving forward over the next year?
There should be, I don't like commissions because they can run and run. I want a task force representative of all the sporting institutions. They've all made pledges, promises and pronouncements. We should have an audit of the respective institutions. Let's look at where we are on all things equal, diverse and inclusive. And that is from participation, social grassroots development, performance, excellence, coaching, administration, leadership, and board representation. That's the pathway. That's the framework. And let's get the best minds that are committed to making a difference and making a sustainable impact, and give that task force a one-year brief. It meets every month. It reports the progress of what it's doing. And at the end of it, it produces a 4 to 5 year action plan that will be held accountable to those responsible to and for it, and signed up by all the sporting institutions. Next year is a rescheduled Olympic and Paralympic Games, or whatever it looks like, and then we have Birmingham 2022. Let's use those milestones almost as the AGM. Birmingham 2022 is going to be a massive statement for me on how far or how not so far we have reached. And for me, it is simply thus. We have a number of young people in this country who are predominantly black, who are confused. They are disorientated. People fail to understand the impact. Forget COVID-19, which has had a disproportionate impact on all black lives and lives of colour. Add the George Floyd movement. A lot of young people are militant, they're angry, they're frustrated, and they want hope and opportunity. Sport and the arts, sport for development, sport for peace, sport for inclusion. You know, it's ironic a 14-year-old schoolboy shot dead on the streets of Marseille on January the 2nd, 1993, which saw James Bulger and then the murder of Stephen Lawrence, have provided the situation where we're being reminded by a Minneapolis loss of a 57-year-old that lives should matter that look like us. And all I'm saying is we need to consider with urgency, because that youth culture isn't going to wait. And when we want a team that represents this country, as it has and did in the 80s, and in part in the 90s, we need to look at the Britain that we want. And when you look at a British team or a British squad, it must reflect the society that it wants to impact upon and influence. And sport has an important role to play, and it must do so. So I think the late President Mandela said, vision without action is but a dream. Action without vision is merely passing time. Vision with action can change the world. If there's a serious intent, a serious purpose, put the task force together, put a terms of reference, After the 80s riots, the then Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, so everyone vilifies, I challenged her at a reception. In 2 weeks, I had an appointment letter. Myself, Clive Lloyd, Steve Ovett, the then Minister for Sport, Colin Moynihan, now Lloyd Moynihan, Judith Mackay, civil servants and businessmen went up and down the country in the cities where the riots had taken place. We produced a report. The recommendations were made. Nothing happened. When I moved to Manchester in the 90s, I was given a report when the gang culture started. Not one of the recommendations were delivered on. That is where we go wrong. And that is why a task force, an action plan, a reported month by month update on the progress made with firm proposals at the end of that 1 year cycle that complements and leads into a rescheduled sporting calendar, and all those taken to the knee, and when they get off of their knees onto their feet, what are they going to do? Everybody has a responsibility.
I totally agree. And Geoff, it's been great talking to you. The article you done for us, the open letter you wrote in June, attracted a lot of attention. A lot of people were in support of the views that you put out there. Hence why I decided it was worth a follow-up just to see where you were. It's a long road ahead. I mean, you've outlined a long road behind you, but it does seem like a long road ahead, and still a lot to do. That looks like a lot that you had to do at the beginning of your journey. But I guess you can't stop pushing, right?
You can't stop pushing. You can't stop fighting. That's why I went back on the streets. Fight for the streets. Those are the streets I've come from. I'll never forget where I've come from. But what I don't understand and what frustrates me is, if I'm in my 63rd year, my father fought for this country, I've represented this country, and I've served it in public life. Why do I feel like a thug? Why do I feel like a threat? Why am I not being afforded as what I should be, a grandee in British sport? Simply still seen as the threat. I was always seen on the streets, in the stadium, on the square. It wasn't bad at all. Why have I had to go back on the streets and on the square to fight for those streets, for those who deserve hope and opportunity? It's not right, it's not fair. But the late Dorothy Coulier, look her up. Before she died, she was 88, and we met in Liverpool 2 days before she died, and she was still fighting. Madiba was still fighting. It's when we become complacent that we end up where we are. And I would say this to anybody who's come post-war, who looks like us: if we all responsibly do what is right, we make it good for those who follow us. And that's what I'm recommitted and dedicated to doing.
Before I let you go, I just need to keep reiterating that you are legitimately trying to qualify for the Olympic Games next year. How's training going?
Training is going in remarkably well. I'm even surprising myself. I've had more rest days than I ever would have done in the freaky heyday of my youth. That's because the muscles ache. So it's amazing what experience does. It's amazing what wisdom does. It's amazing what muscle memory does. But all I say to people, why am I motivated enough? Because lives matter. Black lives have mattered for me since 1993. 7 prime ministers on, the Youth Charter is still denied its place at the top table of what it inspired. By the way, it took another world champion, Geoff Thompson, who's coaching me and my wife, and a former medalist, gold medalist in her sport. That's how we met. But my son, he's taken on the mantle. He was born when the Youth Charter was born. He's now a professional boxer, but he could have ended up victim to the streets. So it isn't disadvantage, it's disaffection. It's where you're not given that belief that you genuinely belong. So I've gone back to what would give me mental, physical, and emotional stability. And in that, I'm in a really good place and cannot wait to dance. Because there's Michael Jordan's Last Dance, brilliant documentary series.
Great documentary, yeah. Great.
It really, really brought to the fore. And I met him in the 80s. Have you noticed Michael Jordan's only come to Britain once?
I didn't notice that, actually. No, I didn't know that.
I met him, that was when they were first launching him, Nike, the brand. And it was Famine for Africa. We met backstage and we really clicked. And all the minders made sure we never spoke afterwards. He left before I'd gone on stage and come off. And I always remember when I did the States and toured the States, we're so, if we look at what sport does, and I want to give a big up to Lewis Hamilton, The brother is staying on point, on message, and he needs to be supported, genuinely supported. Because people like Bernie Ecclestone, I'm afraid I don't expect anything from. They're not going to change. But when we say Mandela was able to bring the world together and unify people, because he showed that you have to be able to change. You tolerate, you forgive, but you don't compromise, because those values are too important. Too many lives have been lost. We've lost too many lives of ambition not realized, not to now. And I have to say, with Paul Elliott's snub, I'm, you know, when are we all going to sit down, stand up, and continue the fight? So I've been told by the World Karate Body that I've insulted the young athletes who aspire to competing in those games. And I have simply responded that it is in total respect of those athletes, but the lives that have been lost on the streets, that's as big a motivation as I need.
Thanks for your time, Geoff. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you.
It's been interesting to talk, and I'm sure we'll catch up again on this issue of, you know, representation, inclusion within the higher echelons of sport. There's lots to do, and we move, as we say.
Absolutely.